little bit of housekeeping before we get started. The recording is in progress. We will be recording today's session, and as with previous ones, we'll be sure to send out the link to that recording at the end of things. And we'll have automatic closed captioning, and if you want to turn that off, you can do that in your settings. And especially today, we're going to be encouraging discussion, a little different than our previous conversations. We're actually going to be breaking out into some breakout rooms and chatting with each other. We can learn a lot from our experience. So mute when you're not speaking, but discussion is encouraged. And if you have any tech questions, you can message Kayla, Augie, or myself, and we'll try to get those sorted out for you. And like I said, thanks for coming and talking with us after that long holiday weekend. Especially those who have come to all of these, that really helps us to build our community of practice. And we hope that these conversations have made you think about new things, sparked ideas for content to incorporate into your programs, maybe your classroom, or even discussions around maybe the dinner table with people in your family. And with these series, we like to top them off with the discussion on kind of pedagogy that helps us to apply the science and ideas that we've been learning. So today, Dr. Sarah Ray is going to help us do that. So we're excited that she's joining us today. She creates existential toolkits for the climate generation, which is a description that I just love. And I think that her interdisciplinary background makes her really a great leader in this field. So she received her PhD in environmental science studies and policy, and her work explores all of the ways that climate change is starting to ripple into our society. And a lot of us see those in our work. So currently she's the professor of environmental studies at Humboldt State University, and she's author of a book that came up in our third discussion, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, How to Keep Your Cool on a Warming Planet. So she's gonna be taking it from here. I'm gonna hand it over, and I'm excited for today's conversation.
Thanks so much, Jenny, and thanks so much everybody who's here. And I really want to send a shout out to somebody who's here. Hi, Jen Ladino. It's nice to see your name in the participants. And I was just telling Kayla and Jenny the story about how the rest is history from the moment you told me I should study this topic in my research. So everyone can just blame Jen Ladino for for anything I have to say right now. So she's so fantastic and such a mentor, a friend, colleague, inspiration to me. And just a quick introduction to how I got into this topic. Which Jen knows very well. I was struggling with a lot of my students' despair around climate anxiety. I am a professor and chair of environmental studies at Humboldt State University, which is a Cal State in the very, very far north of California. We are here on Buoyant territory among the redwoods. The name in Buoyant is Gudini, which is among the redwoods. And in this landscape and at this particular campus, we attract a lot of really idealistic, environmentally and socially minded students. And so I considered them a little bit of like a harbinger of what was going to then become the youth climate movement. And they were teaching me years before Greta Thunberg ever entered the scene what was going on with this generation and how awful things were feeling for them. And as I was describing to Jen so many years ago at a conference that I was buried and burning out myself because of my students' existential despair, my orientation to environmental education, all I had been taught to be a professor. I'm sure many of you have had this experience in your own life too. I just got a lot of content and wrote a dissertation and then turned it into a book. That was the dream of what you're supposed to do as an academic, but no one ever actually taught me how to teach environmental information. No one ever told me that the environmental field and the topics of environmental issues needed to really be trauma informed as we teach. Nobody ever taught me the psychology of emotion and teaching. No one ever taught me about emotions in environmental education. So I was totally, thinking that my job was entirely about getting students to care more about environmental problems and maybe to disrupt some of their cherished beliefs about what nature is and connect them to social justice questions and that sort of thing. That was what I thought I'd spend my career doing. But about 5 or 6 years ago, students' despair around climate injustice and climate change and the problems that we were facing coupled with then the 2016 US presidential election, which made climate change look like it was going to be even more difficult to address, really burned us. We're all burning out. I mean, everybody, I assume I'm speaking here to people who might have been feeling the same way. My students really forced me to come to terms with what it is that they were going to need in their classrooms. They were saying, what we're getting in our classrooms isn't enough. We need existential tools. We don't just need to know how bad things are. We need to know how to get up in the morning and how to get engaged in this work for the long haul that is our lives. And so I turned, thanks to Jen Ladino, I turned that into my research question. What are the tools that they need? And used, lots of different disciplinary fields, psychology for one, but lots of other stuff too, like literary studies and history. And as an environmental humanist, I had all this, other stuff I wanted to think about too, and figure out what I could put on the table for students. So a field guide to climate anxiety is a result of that story. And today, your topic is called recharge. And in talking to Jenny in previous conversations and taking copious notes on what it is that she thinks that you all would respond to from the book and from the work I do, I thought I could talk to you all for hours and hours about all the things that might be part of the book. And I will do a little bit of talking for sure. I will give you some content and little teasers about the book, but I actually would like to open up with breakout rooms. There's 23 of you all, and perhaps we can do 5 or 6 breakout rooms, Jenny and Kayla, whoever is managing that. And this is just random breakout rooms to start with, but the questions that I would like to ask you for you to think about in your breakout rooms, just to get us started, so we have somewhere to go, so I can hear from you all what you're all struggling with, and maybe help me make my time with you even more tailored. I'm putting the questions in the chat, and the questions are: what ails you and your students or those you serve? What struggles or challenges do you face in climate change education, or whichever field that you're in tangential to education? So what are the challenges? What ails your students? What ails those that you serve? And just talk about that. Let's just dump that all out and brainstorm that and have a quick report back with each group, if that's okay, Jenny. Do you want me to do the breakout rooms, or are you setting them up?
I'm working on it here.
Okay, cool.
I'm just going to do automatic. And how many rooms did you want, Sarah?
There's 20. Let's see. There's 20. Now there's 21. I repelled 2 people by saying that.
Just saying breakout rooms.
Oh no, I gotta head out and do my laundry. So 20, so that's like 19 people. So let's do 4 breakout rooms.
Okay, yeah. Great. And Jenny and Augie, you guys can move yourselves around. You're just gonna end up in a room. Okay, here we go. I think. Does that work?
Thanks, Kayla. Yeah, should be going.
Do you want to broadcast a message to everybody?
I can do that on my end too. So
okay, great.
That's right. Yeah, I'll do that when I start to wrap up the time.
Okay.
Okay, I'll head to. It looks like Augie's in room 1.
Tristan, I'm going to assign to room 2 because there's not very many.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, someone came back.
Thanks, Kayla.
Okay.
All right, I just broadcast the questions too, so in case people need to see them again.
Okay, I'll go to room 4, Kayla.
Okay, great. Augie's in room 1. Jen's in room 2. I can let her be.
I'm going to go to room 3 if that's okay.
Okay, great. I'll jump in room 2. Sarah, are you going to pull us back?
Oh, it looks like I'm joining room 3. How do I get out of that? Okay, you brought me back. So somebody should be in. Does somebody have to stay in the main room?
No, but will you be the one to invite us back?
Oh, yeah.
Wait for you. Okay.
Yeah,
great.
I assume I can do that while I'm in the room, right? Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, sounds good. Bye.
Jenny, you're muted.
Oh, I'm curious where the main room is.
Are we in it?
I'm not sure. Oh, here we go.
It was nice to see a lot of faces in the breakout room. Okay, people coming back.
Hello, it looks like everyone's coming back. Very cool. Okay, as everybody comes back, I'll just give them another minute to come back. No, we've got everybody. Looks like we have everybody. Okay. So just because there's so much wisdom in the room already, you all have on the ground experiences with your community or your students. I wanted to get a picture from you all what your challenges are to help me a little bit with tailoring my advice. So if it would be cool to have a person from each group, we had 4 groups. Is that right, Kayla? From group 1, can you just briefly, in a couple of sentences, report back what the kind of key take-home issues that your group expressed? Group 1. Do you remember which group you were in?
I don't.
That was our group, Amy.
That was our group. Oh,
Yeah.
oh, okay.
Okay, thanks, Augie. Go for it,
Okay.
Amy.
Yeah, I can just talk real briefly. So Bridget and I both were just talking about how our audience, our student audience, is predominantly kind of the K through 8th or K through 6th grade group. And so, well, for me personally, finding a way to give the kids kind of actionable items or hope as to their being able to play a part in mitigating, you know, climate change and having, you know, some sort of, you know, part in the problem. And Bridget had a really good, or I think it was Augie actually, who said too, that it's okay also kind of on the flip of that to let kids know, especially younger kids, that it's an adult problem that adults are working on, to kind of take away that, you know, that fear and that scary, you know, idea about what's happening in the world.
Thank you. That's great. I'm taking notes here. So how about group 2?
I was nominated to share out. Our group had a lot of different audiences, from K-12 audiences and to public audiences at state park programs, to college age audiences and tribal audiences. So the gamut of challenges and emotions, despair and anxiety, a sense of trauma, a feeling of wanting to give up because the issue is, can feel so overwhelming. And then also frustration at the lack of access to climate education in the K-12 system in Idaho, as well as a sense that there's a lack of climate literacy in the public that needs to be rectified, and potentially the audience is not understanding or not having the tools to understand how they can generate agency around this, what they can do, and how they can go about it. And final one, a sense of difficulty adapting to change that's driven by impacts of climate that are already here.
Okay, thank you, Kayla. How about group number 3? I know I was a group number 3, but I feel like I'm cheating if I talk.
I believe that was our group, yes.
Yeah, thanks, Amber.
Yeah, you were there. So similar to what everyone else is saying, so we had some teachers in there. We had the PhD student working on his water. I don't know what you're working on for PhD, but you said you are looking into like the water use. But we also, that just how do you communicate about the climate change, but also avoid the despair, and that there is hope and empowering. Like, how can you bring empowerment to the students to combat the despair, that this isn't inevitable or hopeless that we can actually make change and then empower them that they can be part of that change. So.
Thanks, Amber. And group 4, last word.
That was us. And a lot of the topics you brought up, we talked about too. We did touch a little bit about that it's still unfortunately a politicized subject for a lot of us, especially those of us that are rural educators and do outreach in rural areas. So that came up in our group. And then also dealing with a sense of urgency that people feel that not enough is happening, and that students and audiences can feel impatient. And then trickily on the other side of that, also a sense of complacency and apathy in the face of not enough being done.
Great, thank you. Okay, you've given me some stuff to work with, and I really appreciate just hearing from people and hearing where people are coming from. It's really difficult to come just swooping in from some other place and try to connect and make the ideas that I have got going in my mind resonate. So I'm hoping that from what I've heard today, I can do some work to have the things I want to share with you all resonate a little bit more. So with this in mind, I'm going to open up to my content of what I would like to share with you all. I'm going to share my screen and move on to a sharing screen moment here. Forgive me, just one second. Okay, here we go. So the organization of what I want to share with you all is starts with why should we be centering emotions in climate change education? And then I want to move to a second question, which is related, which is what does the science of emotion have to do with climate change, and how can we deploy that more effectively, or how can we use it more effectively in our work? And then I want to talk a little bit about how I try to answer some of those questions in my book, and give us a sort of checklist on how we can move forward with some of these challenges you've just been listing with our own selves for starters, because I think we might be experiencing, our students or young people or whoever our community that we work with, we might be experiencing their trauma, despair, and whatever that we're trying to manage and integrate into our work. But we also have our own with that too. And then I want to move to a personal action plan if we can get there, if we have that much time. An hour is so little, so I'm sorry. I hope that I can speak quickly enough. So why center emotions in climate change education? The first answer to this question is, why center emotions at all in education? And there's a lot of reasons why we haven't centered emotions in education. I won't go into them right now, but it's a whole other topic of conversation. Emotion has been sort of extracted from the sort of cerebral and mental headspace of education and college anyway. We certainly expect students to come in and only bring in their heads and not their hearts, leave their psychological troubles to counseling and psychology services. And especially in environmental education, there has never been seen to need to be a reason to center emotions in that topic, especially because the environment seems to be an emotionless concept. It seems to be out there, away from humans, away from the messiness of society. And so emotions have never seemed to be centered to that topic, although that is changing. Just thinking right now about one of my favorite books by Parker Palmer, The Courage to Teach. If I ever need a pick-me-up and burn out myself, to pick up this book and go to some of my underlined stuff. But just some of the highlights of what he has to say in here is talks about the centrality of emotions in education. Lots of people have made arguments like this, but education should overturn the insistence that students suppress their emotions in order to become technicians. And I would say capitalists, right? So education and higher education anyway is all about pumping out a bunch more people who are going to keep doing the stuff out there that's causing the problem in the first place. So there's an inherent tension in higher education anyway around what we're trying to do with students. It should help students honor and attend to their feelings, especially painful ones. Students should learn to explore feelings about themselves, the work they do, the people with whom they work, the institutional settings in which they work, and the world in which they live. They should learn that painful feelings are not signs of personal weakness, sources of shame, or irrelevant to the complex challenges of knowing, working, and living. We should teach students to stay close to emotions that might become sources of energy to challenge and change institutions. So that really becomes the exciting opportunity with emotions. It's not about becoming therapists, right? Which is similar to what Bell Hooks writes in her book. She talks about, Bell Hooks is a fabulous, wonderful, popular education, Black feminist, Buddhist pedagogy scholar, thinker. And in her beautiful book, Teaching to Transgress, she writes, there are times when I walk into classrooms overflowing with students who feel terribly wounded in their psyches, yet I do not think they want therapy from me, right? I think a lot of resistance to centering emotions is this thought of, I'm not equipped for that, right? But how can we use emotions like that previous quote by Parker Palmer to enhance or charge up students to figure out how to change institutions? And in fact, we are teaching an emotional curriculum. We are working with emotional content, whether we think we are or not. And so owning up to that or being more transparent and explicit about that is really what I'm trying to get us to do in my book. They want an education that is healing to the uninformed, unknowing spirit. They want knowledge that is meaningful. So these are sort of arguments as to why we should integrate emotions in education in general, but around climate change in particular, the argument is even more intense. In addition to being more vulnerable to climate change, young people experience more climate anxiety and eco-grief. In a recent 2021 report, if folks are paying attention to this stuff, when this report came out, all my circles were going crazy and we all got up early to listen to this, the YouTube event of reporting this research in the Lancet article. You can actually now access this online, showed that nearly 60% of young people out of 10,000 young people across the world, and I can explain the methodology more if people are interested, approach said that they feel very worried or extremely worried about climate change. More than 45% questioned that they said had feelings that climate change affected their daily lives. 3/4 of them said that the future was frightening, and over half say that humanity is doomed. And so climate education is all the more urgently needing to think about emotion in its work. Here's another way of looking at it. This is not the same study. This is a Pew study that looked at the difference of concern around climate change according to generation. The blue dot mostly on the right there shows you that young people care more about climate change versus the green dot on the left, the older we get. So if we think about, and in a different talk, I can break this out, but young people have a lot of stuff going on in their generation that makes them, the education that we can deliver in the sort of historical moment we need to all be arriving at, quite different than what it was when I was young and maybe when you were young too. So what does this mean? It means that climate anxiety is really a major part of young people's reality, whether they know it or not. In some cases, they might not call it that, right? It might be called intergenerational trauma. It might be called, police brutality. It might be given other names, but climate change surely is making all of those forms of suffering compounded and worse. So another, just as some like words of my students, these are real world issues that trigger real world emotions. If we neglect our emotions, we're lying to ourselves about the magnitude of effects on the world around us. Let's see here. I had another quote. The amount of emotional and mental work it takes to learn and understand systemic exploitation of people and environment is overwhelming and incredibly stress inducing. So this is just some windows into how it is that some of my students anyway are experiencing some of this intensity. So then I want to move to why it is that we should enlist the science of emotions for climate education. And these arguments to do so feel really airtight to me, and they're not about becoming therapists. Well, like I said, first, emotions dictate actions and behavior change more than data or reason-based appeals. So because climate change has been mostly a topic that's been managed within the sciences, there's not been as much attention to thinking about it as a emotional the work around climate change is going to be more in the realm of emotional work rather than around technological fixes. We still have a dominant worldview that suggests that science and technology, or even politics and economy, maybe secondarily, the social sciences, might be where the big action's happening. But in fact, the science on emotions suggests that the big action that can happen on climate change really is a matter of the heart. And some examples of this that I won't get into right now are things like the way that negativity bias works on our ability to engage in climate work, how the pseudo inefficacy effect changes the way that we engage in work and makes it very impossible for us to get up in the morning and do the work. The resilient zone, this work, maybe some of this from trauma pedagogy, if you're familiar with some of that. The science of emotions shows that different emotions shape climate action in different ways. So we should use this information strategically. So for example, and this is where some of Jen Ladino's work really comes in, different communities and different places respond differently to things like guilt, right? So for some people, guilt is a really activating, useful emotion to drive climate change behavior change, or fear is a really effective emotion. In other places, fear or guilt actually turn people off to this work. So for example, the doom and gloom stories that I heard from in my group, there's actually a self-fulfilling prophecy that happens if we constantly live in a story of doom and gloom and apocalypse, instead of in a positive story of things changing for the better. And there are people working on this, and we're part of a large movement that's doing all the right stuff. And, you know, just participate in it. You'll be part of this collectivity, and it's so empowering, right? So that those different types of stories that we live in really shape whether or not we actually can do anything on climate. And we should be looking very closely at how these different emotions shape action and behavior change, and be deploying them as effectively as we can in the work that we're doing. It's just straight up emotional intelligence, right? Some argue that denial of these negative emotions around climate, like grief or anger, just fuel the problem more, further unraveling kinship ties between humans and the more than human world. So this is the argument of folks like Britt Ray and Caroline Hickman and a bunch of climate psychologists who are talking about, Leslie Davenport's another great example, who talk about the very American toxic positivity, this fetishizing of happiness and cruel optimism, is this the other side of that is a denial of negative emotions, and somehow pathologizing this as a problem that we have. If you have anxiety, you deal with that yourself, and that's a shameful thing that you have over there. So climate emotion people are trying to say, let's look at the positive things that can come out of all of these negative emotions or uncomfortable emotions, and use them strategically to find out what it is that we love, that we're worried about, and that we want to protect, and then figure out steps towards protecting that. Because what happens with a lot of negative emotions is that because of our culture, we just don't want to feel them anymore. So we do whatever it takes to numb from those things, which makes things worse usually. Our own well-being affects our ability to engage in climate work. And this is something that I try to argue with young people. I make this case that, you know, the burning out that young people do to prove that they care about something, or to feel like at least they're scratching the itch of the urgency of the work, in fact, is not what the planet needs from them, right? So the planet actually needs us to slow down. Like Bayo Akamalafe says, the times are urgent, we must slow down, right? This kind of, you know, slowing down is really counterintuitive to the urgency and fear that people have, where we're tapping into our amygdalas to fight, or freeze, when in fact we should be really doing the work to get our prefrontal cortex and our parasympathetic nervous system tapped in, so that we can actually do positive, effective work in where we spend our energy and our time. Climate change is increasingly affecting mental health and vice versa. There's all kinds of studies that are coming out that show how climate change, the actual physical aspects of climate change, like increased heat, are related to psychiatric illness and pollution, how pollution relates to mental health. So breaking down these boundaries between physical health, public health questions, and mental health questions around climate change is forcing us to really see these two things as really overlapping. But there's vice versa too. Just going back to number 4, our mental health affects our ability to engage in climate work, and thereby stem or mitigate climate change, and therefore reduce more of those physical and mental effects of it. So there's a circular loop there. Our emotional lives are essential to decision-making. Any social psychologists and psychologists will tell you this. It's essential to our ability to retain knowledge, our capacity to build community, our ability to figure out what responsible actions are, and to engage in meaningful work despite setbacks. So, you know, paying attention to our emotional lives, if we want to do those things, is really essential. I really want to focus just a little bit on these last ones in what I talk with you about. So to go to this notion of, you know, the emotional work being really central, why should we center emotional knowledge in our climate work? This great quote by Gus Speth, he basically says here, I used to think that, you know, 30 years of science addressing ecosystem collapse and global environmental problems was the top problems, but really there are selfishness and greed and apathy, and we need to deal with those with spiritual and cultural tools and transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. So just kind of putting the punctuation on why it is that we should center emotions in our climate work, here by an actual scientist himself. In my book, I address this in the form of chapters that are sort of the toolkit itself is here in these chapter titles: embracing life in the Anthropocene, getting schooled on the role of emotions in climate justice work, cultivating climate wisdom, claiming your calling and scaling your action to, as an antidote to powerlessness, really. Hack the story. And in this chapter, I talk mostly about how it is that the story we live in affects our ability to engage in stuff. This chapter here, 6, is probably the most relevant to what I've heard from some of the group people in Idaho today, which is be less right and more in relation. And this chapter is all about how it is that we communicate with people who might not be on the same page as we are about climate change. And that goes for both within the progressive movement around climate change and social justice questions, and also across party lines where there's climate denial. Climate denial is actually only 7% of American view about climate change right now. And I suppose they're all in Idaho from what it sounds like, from what you all have said. But there are some really great tools in that chapter for this topic. And also many other people are really spending a lot of time thinking about this. Ditch guilt, move beyond hope, and laugh more. So we are human animals, just like all the animals, and our actions around climate change have to feel like they're making a difference, have to feel positive, have to feel joyful, or else we will stop doing them. We will burn out. And so what is the role of pleasure in this work? What is the role of community building? What is the role of things like hope and laughter and those emotions that feel good? Resist burnout and feed what you want to grow. These are the tools I write about. In sort of putting all those tools in a different format, this is sort of the checklist for you and or the people you work with. Are you personally resourced? If you're resourced, if our cups are full, we can weigh the pros and cons rationally and act in service of our mission and values. So that's the burnout part, right? Are we living in a story of resilience, hope, and progress? Or are we living in a story of decline, unraveling, and apocalypse? And this has very much to do with the 85% of dominant social media, the 24/7 news cycle that we have access to in this day and age, that is almost entirely in the negative frame around climate change. Solution stories are not appealing to dominant mainstream news because they would like to capitalize on our negativity bias. That is the way media works. And so if we understand how media works and how the stories around climate change are in fact only really meant to make us feel powerless and despairing, it helps us to put our attention in other stories and live in a different story. The reason we need to do that is not because we want to be in denial, but because we need to be in an affective location in our own hearts and minds to be able to engage in this work. Are we constantly aware that we aren't acting alone, that we're supported and surrounded by community? And again, this is contrary to individualism of American identity, both in terms of whether or not we have any power on the world, but also whether or not there's a sense of like, I can't do anything alone, I'm only a drop in the bucket. That's a very American individualist notion, again, related to the story of whether I'm part of this collective, force of people who are doing these actions. So this sense of collectivity has been a real insight for me. And some of you mentioned this in our group, that feeling like a part of community is a source of great despair if you don't have that. Are we visioning what we want? What kinds of collective structures of mutual support do we want instead of what exists now? What do we desire about the future? Adrienne Brown has this great quote that I love to say all the time. What do we desire about a climate change future? What would it take to thrive in a climate change future? It's turning everything on its head. It's like a strategic question. Instead of saying, how do we avoid the apocalypse? It's saying, how do we actually build something we desire? It's a very different orientation towards climate crisis. Do we feel we have control over some conditions of our lives? Several people in the group I was in, group 3, talked about actionable, scalable, local things that people can do. That ticks off a bunch of these items, right? That ticks off the sense of community, that ticks off the sense of having control over the conditions of our life, or efficacy, a sense of efficacy. So in the end, a sense of efficacy in community seems to be the golden ticket for combating eco-anxiety in the research that I've done. Do we see our actions as connected to a larger purpose? And this has to do with when I feel like the actions don't matter and there's never going to be any outcome that's positive for this, that tapping into a larger sense of purpose is really essential for resilience to get us through those difficult moments. So this checklist is like a actionable way of dealing with the chapters of my book. They're all in the book. And so I'm just thinking about time right now. I'm going to stop share. Whoops, stop share. What have I done? Just thinking about time. Awesome. Okay, I'm good. We're good with some time. So what I'd like to do is take another look at, so these topics that we have, I'm going to create them in the breaker. Actually, Jenny, can I read off the topics that I've collected from what everybody's report back from the beginning? We're going to have 4 groups, Jenny. From what it sounds like from the beginning, one group will be about the politicization of climate change and talking to people who for whom this is just a taboo topic, right? Another topic will be how to balance hope versus despair in younger kids, because a lot of people here seem to be working with more of a K-8 group, and I think it would be nice to have them in a group together. The third topic would be the third topic will be the difficulty adapting to current climate crises. Somebody mentioned that. I think Kayla talked about the question of agency in current climate crisis. And then the fourth one will be about the topic of complacency and apathy. So those are the 4 issues that you all brought to the table in our breakout in the beginning. What I'd like to do now is have you decide which group you want to be in. Jenny has just put in the chat which group you could choose to be in. So you choose manually which breakout group you want to go into, 1, 2, 3, or 4. And then I'll put in the chat also the action plan questions that you're going to do here. So real quick, right here, I would like you to choose a topic from this initial report back, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Then go into that group, and with that group, brainstorm barriers and solutions to this problem. And then consider what the next elegant steps might be. And then if you can get there, what would be your next elegant step for you? What could you do? Questions before I let you all run into your groups. I know you didn't think you'd be a student in this session. Solving your own problems. How dare I? Okay, break it up, Jenny. Thank you.
Okay.
Or Kayla, whoever's doing it. Thanks, Kayla.
Can we have folks maybe hold up a finger with what group they want to be in, and then we can assign you to that.
I'm allowing people, I think, to.
Yeah,
Okay.
you can allow people. People can do
Great.
it themselves. It's amazing.
All right.
Is that happening?
It looks like it.
Good.
Cool.
And I can help too. I'm seeing David, where would you like to go? 4? You seen that?
4 is fine. It helps if you unmute.
Great, there you go. And Jen, where would you like to go?
I'll figure it out. I'm still thinking.
Okay.
I can join though.
John? 3, okay. And Carrie? You want to hold up a finger? Oh, you found it. Okay, great. Janice, would you like me to assign you 2? Okay, perfect. See you later.
And then Augie, do you have a copy of the question 2? I'm copying it and jumping into a group. So I'll go to room 1.
Great.
Cool. Yeah.
All right.
I'll just fill in maybe in room 3.
Where are you going, Augie?
I think I'll go to room 2. We'll just fill in a little bit because there's a lot in room 2 already.
I'll go to room 4.
Okay.
Hi. People must be, I love it when people take a while to come back from their breakout groups because it seems like they must be having good conversation or something.
I'm sure glad you joined our breakout.
Yay, that was so great.
Yay. We're so lucky.
I just said that particular topic, we don't have to choose hope or despair, right? They're connected, really. How do we inculcate that in younger people is really a good challenge. There are so many great resources on that. Leslie Davenport has just written a book for junior high level people, All the Feelings Under the Sun. And the Climate Psychology Alliance has a ton of resources on youth, young youth meaning younger than college, you know. So I would recommend that for that group if there's desire for diving in deeper into it. Okay, we've got 15 people back, so I'm gonna run with it. Can I hear one or two action items, next elegant steps? We don't have to go through all of the groups, but does anybody have a burning next elegant step in general or for themselves that they feel committed that they want to do next to address the problem that was in their group?
I was in group 1 and we talked. We didn't quite get to the next steps because we got talking a lot about just kind of each other's perspectives. Our group was the politicization group. Saying that wrong, too many syllables. But basically politics getting in the way of talking about things. And I was fortunate to be in a group where we had a professor who teaches on this. So we kind of just talked about tips and tricks. And I think the main thing that came out of our discussion was that it's important to know your audience before you speak to them, whether it's students or a larger audience. Know where they're coming from and what beliefs they might come into your space with about climate change. And then maybe sort of cater to that. Like, it feels a little dishonest to say that, but make sure that you are not denying their identity or their beliefs when you come into the room and speak to them. So I guess the next action step that you could do is do the work of knowing a little bit about your audience before you talk to them. Like, investigate a little bit about where it is that they're coming from.
That's great. Yeah. And there's this swath of Americans who care about climate change, but are afraid of what it means for what changes they're going to have to make. So how do you get for them from A to B? There's a lot of work that can be done there. I love that topic. I think a lot about. One more next elegant step, and then I'll have my last slide. If anybody has one. That was great, Jenny.
We in our group, we were covering a little bit of the negativity. And I think it's really important when we're looking at climate change that we're not trying to keep the earth in its current condition, because that's an impossibility. And we need to understand that scientifically it's not going to be what it is today. And so we need to find positive ways to encourage people to say, hey, we have to adapt, and how can we adapt in a way that's going to be positive for our community, positive for us financially, positive for us environmentally.
Yeah, that sense of we're working to build a world we desire to live in, as opposed to we're working to avoid a catastrophe, is a lot more motivating, and people want to participate in that a lot more. Just that framing of the conversation as a positive thing. What is what we desire rather than what is what we fear is a huge change, because in fact, there's a reason for that. The neuroscience of that is there, right? There's a reason for that. Thank you, David. Absolutely. So I've asked people if they want to can dump their next elegant steps into the chat so we can see some of that. I'll just have one final last slide to say goodbye. That was a personal action plan. If you'd like to do some more of this work, here's a slide that you can kind of take a snapshot of, or try to think through in terms of taking a big problem that feels intractable and making a next immediate action step for yourself to the best of your ability, in collective or on your own, because there's always something we can do. A fun activity that I won't do with you, I'm just putting this out there, a DIY, an affective audit of your, whatever that is that you do. You can do an audit, an emotional audit of something that you do, like a curriculum or an assignment or a module. What do you assume your students feel about the content before you get into this setting? That goes to the point Jenny was just making. Turn to your artifact, map out all the feelings that the artifact might create in your students to the best of your knowledge, right? And then backward designing, what would you want them to feel, and how would you want them to feel by the end of whatever you're doing with them? And how can you build that into your activity? And do you provide enough room in your work to do the processing and learning around emotional intelligence and the pausing and the metabolizing that is sometimes needed for this work? And then finally, considering revisions, what would the artifact, how would the artifact value these other things more than what it might be valuing, right? So this is just a fun activity. Fun is not the right word, but an activity that I do in workshops with other educators over a long course of time, and just give you a little taste of that. And my last slide, just a thank you with a couple of my favorite quotes from Robin Wall Kimmerer. Even a wounded world is feeding us. Even a wounded world holds us, giving us moments of wonder and joy. I choose joy over despair, not because I have my head in the sand, but because joy is what the earth gives me daily, and I must return the gift. And of course, the one I mentioned earlier, the times are urgent, let us slow down. So I do a bunch of stuff on this. I have a climate wisdom lab. I'm happy to bring to whoever your group is, that if you want to do more work on this in several hours or over days, whatever works for you. And I'm building an existential toolkit for climate justice educators as a book. And there's also a website here, and I'll share my slides with Jenny so she can pass them out to you all when I'm done. But thank you for your time and all of your thoughts. And I'm done now.
Thanks, Sarah. It's great to see you.
Thank you. Real quick, folks, I'm going to drop a link in the chat to our final survey. If you could fill that out, that helps us learn what you took away from the sessions and what you'd like going forward. So thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone for continuing to join us in these conversations.